I just fell in love with it, really, because I realised very quickly that cultural burning was such a powerful tool for cultural transmission. It was such a powerful tool for managing the land. It was, and it's such a powerful tool to bringing non-Indigenous people into that conversation as well, because fire is a shared resource, and for non-Indigenous people, fire is something that they fear. And so all of a sudden, if you get into this context of, if you're bringing a context of like fire and how you can harness it, how you can use it, how you can make safe, volatile ecosystems, and obviously responding and mitigating against the larger threats of climate change, it really gets non-Indigenous people. And I knew that it got them as soon as I started to study it. And so I just kind of went, this is a place where you can, like, it fulfills so many of my passions. I can see myself in the work, and I can see it as a tool to bring non-Indigenous people into a very real conversation of supporting Aboriginal groups and their land management aspirations in Australia. So I guess that's kind of why, I guess the journey of how I came to it. I guess the other thing to say is I just love it because it's not, it's kind of, I think the thing that I love about it most is that, yes, it is cultural. Yes, it is intellectual. Yes, it is political. It is philosophical. It draws in all of these things, but it's so tangible. It is about people on the ground. It is about people and their feet and their physical presence being on and in the landscape, and them doing things in the landscape, and them talking and being who they are in the land. And I just love that there's nothing, that it's completely practical. You can reach it, you can touch it, you can see it, you can taste it, you can be it.
Hey folks, what's happening? Welcome to Your Forest. My name is Matthew Kristoff, and on this podcast, we talk about the environment and the science of sustainability. Now, today's episode, even though it is on schedule, is actually a bonus episode. I have another episode coming out next week, which will be kind of the more regular scheduled normal episode following the normal suit. This one is actually a special edition. So, if you're not aware of the Good Fire podcast, which I'm also a part of, I co-host that with Dr. Amy Cardinal Christensen. And it's all about Indigenous fire stewardship and cultural burning. And if you don't know what that is, you're about to find out. It's very, very cool, very, very interesting, and a space that I have learned a lot about recently. And so this episode of Your Forest podcast is actually a release of the first episode of season 2 of the Good Fire podcast. And I felt it was a really good idea because the guest we had on, Bhiamie Williamson, is such an incredible speaker, so interesting to listen to. He really encapsulates the concepts and the difficult to understand social issues and the history and all the things that need to be thought about when we're talking about equity and we're talking about social, environmental issues, right? And such a great conversation. I can't wait for you guys to have it. So yeah, we're going to listen to this. I'm just going to let her fly. And if you want to listen to more stuff like this, you can check out Good Fire wherever you get your podcasts. So yeah. Sponsors. West Fraser is the number one sponsor for 2022. Without them, this would not be possible. Thank you, West Fraser, for your continued support. And Greenlink Forestry has been with me since the beginning, and I cannot thank them enough for all their support. And I look forward to more years to come. So yeah, with that, here is season 2, episode 1 of Good Fire podcast with Dr. Amy Cardinal Christensen and Bhiamie Williamson. Here we go. This is the Good Fire Podcast. Stories of Indigenous fire stewardship, cultural and social empowerment, and environmental integrity. So, Bhiamie, what, if you don't mind, I'm going to start. Because we don't know each other. I want to know a little bit about why you're doing this work. How did you get into this, and why is it clearly, listening to the articles and the panels that you've been on, it's a passion of yours. So yeah, why this work?
Yeah, so I got into this work, excuse me, so I'm just thinking of where's the right place to start. So I got into this. I've always had a love for country, right? Always, as an Aboriginal person, as an Aboriginal kid growing up in Australia, I was very lucky to grow up really close to my country, to culture, to family. You know, as kids, we were always taken out onto our country, always sort of, you know, had access to the fishing and to, you know, to catching yabbies, as like kind of little Australian native crayfish and freshwater crayfish, and yeah, always swimming in the rivers and going out and learning country and the, you know, the stories and that kind of thing. So, and just being with people on the land, you know, we always had that. And so I don't know, and obviously you don't think about it at the time, but when I reflect back, it was just so many formative experiences. And what it did was instilled a deep sense of love for the land and for culture, and for being there with people, with family. And then I think what happened was later on in my studies at university, I was kind of wandering around the university, wandering around between degrees, and didn't really know what I wanted to do, and was kind of feeling a bit lost at the university. But then I found a home in the School of Environment because of this, you know, like I come to learn of it as a discipline of like of physical geography, right? Being out on the land itself and being out sort of like amongst the native wildlife, and then looking at the different ecosystems and ecosystem services that, you know, that are naturally and I guess unnaturally put into the landscape, and that go into managing a landscape. And then that kind of came. So I was studying environmental studies, and I was also studying political science, and I kind of was caught in this space in between, and I really wanted to explore this in between space. And for me, that opportunity came when I started working with Aboriginal ranger groups. So you had the physical geography, you had the cultural kind of spiritual, you know, backgrounds of people that you're working with, and of myself, and you got to engage myself in the context of the research and what I was doing. But whilst engaging with kind of larger political forces and social and economic forces outside of the context of communities. So, yeah, I just sort of started working with ranger groups, and I ended up doing my honours thesis with 3 different Aboriginal ranger groups from North and South Australia. And a big part of their work was cultural burning across all 3 different groups. And yeah, I just fell in love with it, really, because it's, I realized very quickly that cultural burning was such a powerful tool for cultural transmission. It was such a powerful tool for managing the land. It was, and it's such a powerful tool to bringing non-Indigenous people into that conversation as well, because fire is a shared resource, and for non-Indigenous people, fire is something that they fear. And so all of a sudden, if you get into this context of, if you're bringing a context of like fire and how you can harness it, how you can use it, how you can make safe, volatile ecosystems, you know, and obviously responding and mitigating against the larger threats of climate change, it really gets non-Indigenous people. And I knew that it got them as soon as I started to study it. And so I just kind of went, this is a place where you can, like, it fulfills so many of my passions. It really, like, I can see myself in the work, and I can see it as a tool to bring non-Indigenous people into a very real conversation of supporting Aboriginal groups and their land management aspirations in Australia. So I guess that's kind of why, like, I guess the journey of how I came to it. And I guess the other thing to say is I just love it because it's not, it's kind of, I think the thing that I love about it most is that, yes, it is cultural. Yes, it is intellectual. Yes, it is political. It is philosophical. It draws in all of these things, but it's so tangible. It is about people on the ground. It is about people and their feet and their physical presence being on and in the landscape, and them doing things in the landscape, and them talking and being who they are in the land. And I just love that there's nothing, that it's completely practical. You can reach it, you can touch it, you can see it, you can taste it, you can be it. And I just
That's
love
awesome.
Now,
That's really
Bhiamie,
cool.
you've written a bit about the idea of Indigenous healing. And I think it really relates to what you're talking about here with, that connectedness to land and, how country is more than just a landscape to Indigenous people. Like when we look at a landscape or our territory, it's about, relations and family and more than just, what other people might see there. So I'm just wondering, can you speak a bit more to that concept of Indigenous healing and how you see cultural fire being a part of it?
Yeah, sure. So healing, obviously, as Indigenous peoples all over the world, we have our own traditions of healing. We have our own healing practices, our own healing, tools, our own healing medicines and things. And fire is a really big part of our healing practices. Whether you're smudging up in North America or you're smoking down here in Australia, fire is central in the healing of people and always has been. And I think that, I've always just kind of working in this space, as we all know, there's so much trauma in our communities. People have never had the opportunity, I feel, to kind of pick themselves up and dust themselves off from colonization. People have never had the opportunity to look around and sort of ask, what the bloody hell happened to us? And I just feel like being out on the land and cultural burning provides that opportunity to be out on the land and to do things. It's like everything about it it's immersive and it's restorative. And, when you're going out there with people and you're learning and you're being and you're doing, it's just, it's a wholesome feeling that you don't get otherwise. And those opportunities are so rare for our people. Mm-hmm. They're so precious. And so, yes, we might be managing the land and using fire to managing the land, but what we're really doing is healing our spirits, and healing the spirit of the land. So, I just think that the opportunity, land management more generally, but especially using fire, it has, what it does to our people is truly incredible. And, and you don't, you can take Indigenous people onto the land with you and sort of go through that with them, even if they might not be from there. They definitely feel it. Mm-hmm. You just need to be an Indigenous person and have access to that kind of, to know what's going on and to feel, and to feel culture and to know what it looks like, what it feels like, to have access to that. So, I think that we need to continually find ways to promote healing, and I think we just need to find healing in all of our daily practices, but healing won't just, from what we know about healing, it's like you can't, you need to want to heal, right? You need to want to overcome the wounds of the past and to heal the wounds of the past, and that starts individually, but it emanates and is facilitated collectively as well. And the land is center in that process. One of the things I've learned from the healing space, from the healing from the disciplines of therapeutic interventions and psychology. I'm not a psychologist, but I have done graduate degrees in Indigenous healing and sort of understanding that field. And what I know from that is that the general field of psychology and things like mental health support, mental health practitioners, they don't give Indigenous peoples what we want. We don't have Indigenous theories of psychology. We don't have a well-developed Indigenous psychological kind of therapeutic kind of model. We don't have that. It hasn't been developed. That work is yet to be done. It's such a missing part. But that doesn't mean we don't know what works. We know
That's
that on the land works. And so let's support and create opportunities for what we know works. And being on the land and using fire is like I said, it's a precious thing.
Yeah, one of the things that's been really interesting to me, like we've gone through quite a fire season in Canada here in 2021. We usually have about 20 to 30 evacuations a year, but I think we're at 210 now by our count at the Canadian Forest Service, and lots of those are Indigenous communities. And one of my frustrations with watching it has just been thinking, why is it taking settlers so long to figure this out? Like most of the Indigenous people that are interviewed that are impacted by fire, they've said, we need more burning on the landscape. We need to renew that relationship with our territory and heal. And it just seems like every time it kind of, falls, like it always, when the event happens, it's at the front, but then as life goes on and things, it just seems to always fall to the side to me. And then, we get into the next event, the next experience, and we're saying the same things again.
Is it just a bureaucratic boundary you think you're hitting up against, or what? What do you think it is, Amy?
Yeah, colonization pretty much I don't know what Bhiamie thinks, what his experience is. And maybe this is a good time too to just chat about you guys just went through in 2020 quite a bushfire crisis yourself. And Bhiamie, you wrote an incredible article with Vanessa and Jessica on, perpetual grief after what Indigenous people are experiencing, seeing happen to our landscapes, and going through the bushfire events again in Australia. I think it had a really big impact on your Aboriginal populations. And I know you've talked a lot about how, they're, your Aboriginal, or how Aboriginal peoples in Australia are disproportionately impacted by fire events. So yeah, do you have any, I know you have a lot of experience in this area and a lot of things. So we'll just open the floor to you to chat.
Yeah. So, I think sort of before going into that fire up, a couple of years ago now in Australia, I do just want to acknowledge that, the truly incredible fire season that you've all endured, up in the north, and, just sort of sitting here watching it, it's just heartbreaking. It's just, there's no other way to describe it. Just thinking of, of the people who have been displaced, who watch their their ancestral lands burn, and burn not in a good way. It's just devastating, and just traumatizing. So, and we know that when Indigenous people get evacuated, they are exposed to more trauma and grief because of their being forced into systems that generally they don't have say over. It's so just acknowledging that, and that it's just really, it was just heartbreaking to see. And so, like we've been thinking about you guys for quite some time now, because I know this season has really gone on for some time, up there.
Thanks, Bhiamie. It's like how I felt in 2020 watching you guys. It's just heartbreaking to see all of this going on.
Yeah, it is. And I think, Amy, what it points to is that, like, even though we're divided by, the biggest ocean on earth, we see each other. We know each other, like we are kind of kin in this, increasingly small world. And there's a way of life that we share and an ethic that we share, that we stand with each other, and we are, we're, unlike the rhetoric of non-Indigenous people at the start of COVID, only for it to fall apart, we actually are in it together, so it's I don't know, it's a heavy burden to bear, but knowing that we bear it with other Indigenous peoples all over the world really lightens the load. So, just sort of acknowledging that. I think the fires that gripped Australia, that were just so, I don't know, like nothing like we ever thought could happen before, on a scale, in a ferocity and an intensity that was just relentless and overwhelming. At the height of that, it's kind of like the whole cultural burning discourse in Australia was kind of scratching at the surface for a number of years before that event. It was kind of people were hearing about it. It was coming up a little bit in the media. There was a really influential book that was published about it a few years before that. So people were aware, and then the fires hit, and what it did, all of a sudden, just an explosion of interest in Aboriginal people's cultural burning. Now, with a background in cultural burning, we were asked to write an article about sort of connecting cultural burning to the crisis, but we felt that was the wrong time to write it, to focus on that, because something else was unfolding that no one was capturing, and as far as we know, hadn't been captured adequately or sufficiently in other bushfire crises before, because even though we didn't have the raw data in terms of, census counts, population statistics, demography, that kind of thing, we knew intrinsically that the fires were hitting in areas that had really high populations of Aboriginal people. A lot of communities, a lot of townships with really big Aboriginal populations. And we also knew, and you intrinsically know, that the way Indigenous peoples experience these kind of disasters is very different to non-Indigenous people. Damage to the land, trauma to the land has a deeper kind of impact on Indigenous peoples. But even though we knew these things, no one was talking about it. It wasn't being captured. And so that's why we wrote that article, to draw attention to something that we knew, but that non-Indigenous people either did know and didn't have the language to talk about, or didn't know at all. And so we wanted to draw attention to that. And so that's why we wrote that article. And I can just sort of, that article seemed to have taken off like a wildfire of its own and really hit a point that really resonated with people and hit it at the right time as well. Because since then there's been a real acknowledgement by governments, by the academy, by NGOs, that the way that they need to support Indigenous peoples through these kind of catastrophes is different, and they need to target Aboriginal people. They need to involve Aboriginal people, employ Aboriginal people in their organisations. They need to have Aboriginal reference groups. They need to have targeted strategies that support communities in ways that they need support. And that didn't happen before. So it's kind of sad to think about. It took right up until sort of 2020 that people started to acknowledge that openly. But it has happened, thankfully, because in an era of climate change, these catastrophes are just going to continue. They're going to, heaven forbid, be made worse. And we know that Indigenous peoples continue to live in areas that are more prone to catastrophic events and natural disasters. So this has got this is a train on a very, very long track. So we've got a long way to go with this stuff. I'm not sure if there's anything else, any other specific questions.
Well, I wanted to get you to maybe go into more detail about the context of how you feel Aboriginal communities and Aboriginal people cope with, very bad wildfire seasons versus non-Indigenous people, right? Because I think there's a context there that non-Indigenous people aren't really going to understand. So what was your emotional state going into this in relation to your non-Indigenous colleagues or friends? And then how do you think, how can we explain the difference to someone that may not be able to experience that? Yeah,
so it's easy to generalize and sort of say, trauma to the land. And there is an element of that, but what we're really talking about are people who have connections to certain parts of the land. And so if you think about the country here is full of it's a living museum for our people. We've got trees that have been marked and carved and altered. We've got stone arrangements. We've got petroglyphs. We've got, all of these kind of man-manipulated parts of the environment that are part of our memory, that are part of our cultural heritage. Like I said, it's our museum isn't in some fancy building in a capital city. It's outside. It's in the bush. It's on the land. And so, like for people to think about, how devastating it was for something like the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris that burned down, that happens through these wildfires to Indigenous peoples all the time. That's what we see unfold. The depths of people's trauma and grief, that's that culture shock. That's what we experience. And then you also engage with people's living culture. So, like I spoke before about sort of healing traditions, like a lot of our medicines come from plants, comes from certain animals, comes from certain springs, natural kind of water springs. These are all the things that are just devastated when an out of control, intense fire rips through the landscape. And so it has a direct impact on on our access, on our ability to access and to practice cultural traditions like gathering of medicines and utilization of medicines and other resources as well. So like here in Australia, I know that people use kind of things like native sedge or reeds or sort of certain barks and whatnot for things like weaving, for creating of mats and of baskets and that kind of thing. All of that stuff is just destroyed, in wildfire. So people don't have the resources to for their art and for just to make the things that they traditionally make. That stuff will take generations to replenish. And so, you've got longer term consequences as well of one, not being able to do it, but two, not being able to pass that on to your kids, and there might be a 20, 25 year gap between you being able to go out and do that again as you did before. And that's on the proviso that there isn't another fire that comes through and destroys it. People are connected to plants, and to animals. So like me, my family has a totem, an animal a native Australian animal. So for us, it's the bigibilla or the echidna that we are connected to. And we've got responsibilities to that animal. And for Aboriginal groups right around the country, they continue to associate very closely with certain native animals or birds or, aquatic species. These are all the things that are being also displaced, also devastated and, destroyed with these catastrophic events. So if I'm someone from a certain part of the landscape who has an attachment to a particular bird, and my cultural existence is entwined with the existence of that bird in the landscape, and that bird is destroyed in a huge wildfire event and displaced and does not come back, what does that mean for the way that I exist as an Indigenous person? These are very serious issues, and they are highly consequential for Indigenous peoples to be able to live in the world as they know it and for them to be who they are. So, yes, the way that Indigenous peoples experience these events and the consequences of these events for Indigenous peoples are very different. They are deeper. They are long-lasting. And, unfortunately, in emergency management around the world, I'm yet to find an emergency management agency that when a wildfire hits goes to the Indigenous people and says, what are the important things for you for us to protect? They don't do that. It goes life, property, environment in that order, But for Indigenous people's life is not just human life, it's all life. And so we are so isolated and marginalised in the structures of emergency management, and that, doesn't bode well for what our priorities are.
Yeah, I was going to say, Bhiamie, that's really interesting. It brought up to me a meeting that I had with an agency, and I won't say who here, but because they were complaining at the agency because they had a meeting with some Indigenous elders before about, what should be protected during wildfire situations. And in the meeting I was at, they were complaining and saying, they just want us to protect everything, like, well, how are we going to protect, like they say everything's alive and everything's connected, but how are we going to, do this all? We're only, we can't stop the fires. So yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a lazy response, and it's something that we just hear all the time. One, you should be protecting everything. First of all, that's your job. Do your job.
Yeah.
And we know that the best form of protection is prevention. And so, like for people who are like, if you're fair income about protecting it, you need to lobby. You need to get into the faces and ears of politicians and senior bureaucrats and say, we need to take this seriously. Now is the time to make safe our environment, not when the fire hits. That prevention work is so incredibly important. And also, and that's when you can really engage in a conversation with Indigenous peoples about how are we looking after the land? You need to be forming those relationships ahead of time. But in terms of protection in an emergency event, in Australia, through that really bad summer, a couple of summers ago, what emerged from that didn't exist before is that from where I know, there were two places in Australia, one in Queensland, one in Victoria, where in the emergency management, like the IMT, the incident management team, the room in a disaster event, the room that makes decisions, that formulates strategies, that directs where the tankers go, where the people go, where the water bombers go. In two places, not an Aboriginal person, a representative of that traditional group was, and who had a lot of experience in sort of parks, services and firefighting, so people with the relevant experience, were brought into the room. And when they were brought into the room, they weren't just brought into the room to sort of, roll out a map and sort of say, where are your heritage values, and we'll kind of protect that. No, it was like they brought them into the room and they said exactly what you said, Amy. We know all the land is sacred. We know you want to protect everything. Let's have a conversation with this disaster that's unfolding, the fire front that's here, the wind that's going to blow in this direction, a forecast of this hot, of a day of this degrees, all of these conditions. Let's have a conversation now around how we can manage this to the best possible effect. And what happened was that in both instances, the approach of the emergency management agencies fundamentally changed because of what the Indigenous person told them. And it wasn't just about cultural heritage values and protecting sacred sites and that kind of thing. It was actually about knowledge of the land. It was actually about the person in the room saying, okay, when the wind blows from here, there's this formation in the land, and I know it's hard to see on this map, but it'll make the wind do this, and these are the areas of concern. In one of the areas, the soil on the, obviously underneath the grass, but the soil or the geographic uniqueness and the physical features of that place meant that they couldn't or shouldn't put in mineral earth lines. So for people who don't know, like mineral earth is where you get a dozer in or whatever, and you just grate the hell out of the land, and you rake it all, you remove all the things, so you kind of get a hard earth line where fire shouldn't be able to spread across. Mm-hmm. And so they said, in one instances they said these are the areas of concern. In another instance they said you can't put mineral earth lines in here because of the geography of the area. And all of these things, like in a high pressure environment when decisions need to be made quickly, and you've got limited resources and limited time, this is really important information, and it enhances the ability of emergency management agencies to effectively deal with the disaster. And in both instances, what happened was an incredible outcome. What they had was the effective management of an extreme wildfire event. Right? You had the significant reduction of the fire spread in an area, like significantly reduced from what they expected to do from even the day before. You had Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples working together on the ground. You had, obviously, the empowerment of Indigenous peoples in those spaces. You had what it turned out to be was the incredible protection of cultural and heritage values. You had the preservation of certain pockets of wildlife that acted as refuges for wildlife to escape and for birds and animals to escape to. And like you had the protection of water catchment areas as well, and a lot of it, like all around, just like bang, 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 bang. You had all these amazing outcomes, and it all stemmed from bringing an Indigenous person who knew who knew about fire, who knew about land management, who had a long history who had histories in these kind of agencies. Bringing them into the room and asking them not where are your heritage values, but let's have a conversation around this fire threat, right? What should we be doing? And I think that's the blueprint moving forward. That's what needs to happen. We need to have Indigenous peoples in every region, in every bioregion around the world, sufficiently qualified to sit in those rooms, to enter those rooms and participate, and to actually be in the conversation around how do we deal with this unfolding disaster. Their knowledge is a strategic asset. And yes, they contribute, not in a way that's like detrimental to the emergency management efforts, but actually significantly enhance it. The evidence is in, we make a difference.
That's fascinating.
And we need to pay them too. I'll just add, not volunteer work.
We're getting started, right?
I know.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, let's bring you in and we'll learn from your knowledge. But yeah, thanks. Bye.
Thanks, go away. Yeah. That's fascinating for me to hear that. Like, I find that just incredible because I remember reading one of the articles that you wrote. There was a quote in there. You said, agencies must be equipped with the basic knowledge of our people's different circumstances, which I think you just portrayed why that's important, right? Like why that is needed and how that ultimately is going to help everybody. And it's just needed. It's a must have. And when I read it, I had the thought of one time I was at a conference and I'm a forester by trade, and it was a conference about Indigenous consultation, which is a whole mess, as you probably know. But one of the speakers stood up and she said, is it reasonable to ask a forester to have all of this knowledge, right? And my thought was, it may not be reasonable as we don't have the background to know it, but it should be reasonable. It should be expected going forward, right? Like, it is one of those things that should be involved. Like, people that have already gone through school, yeah, maybe they don't have those tools. They've never had that experience or that opportunity. But how do we create the opportunity for agencies to, I don't even know if I'm asking the right question, but how do we make it so that knowledge is something that is attainable for them, or the right people are in place so that those Aboriginal folks can be at the table helping make decisions and providing that context? Yeah.
Good question. And it comes up consistently here in Australia as well. On a personal level, I just find it so fascinating that people can consider themselves land managers and not know who the native people are for those places.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
To me, that just represents such a deeply colonial process and deeply colonial way of thinking and being. And that's what we really need to overturn. And non-Indigenous peoples know this stuff as well.
Hey, but I'm a professional.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Bhiamie and I have talked a lot about that whole thing of who's the expert, right? And lots of times Indigenous people aren't recognized because you might not have the degree or other things, but that's been one huge frustration this year. And I've seen it in BC and articles about Manitoba, Ontario is, as much as we loved the Australian colleagues, that flew in here, that were exported to help, there's a lot of Indigenous people who are very frustrated at why they're not getting the calls in to provide advice and expertise because they don't, have those kind of colonial recognized certificates.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, Indigenous peoples don't have those qualifications because we weren't allowed to.
Yeah, there you go, right? Another thing, yeah.
Yeah, so we weren't allowed to participate. Like even in Australia, like the first Aboriginal graduate at a university wasn't until like the 1970s, because we weren't allowed to be there. And so when people say, "Oh, you don't have the qualifications," it's like, well, maybe if you people didn't discriminate against us and let us get it, this would be a very different conversation. But look, there are systems of oppression, centuries of oppression, that remain ongoing, but that have meant that Indigenous peoples have not been able to participate equally in society. And that is something that we still suffer from, and it should not be weaponized against Indigenous peoples. Going back to the original thing of like working with peoples, I find it just absolutely the idea that it's a burden for non-Indigenous peoples to work effectively with Indigenous peoples. I find it just straight up offensive, because as Indigenous peoples, that's what we're expected to do all the time, every single day of our lives, from the time we wake up to the time we go to sleep. For us to be in this world, we need to know how to work in a non-Indigenous system, how to work in a settler colonial system. We need to know how to participate, how to communicate, and how to act respectfully, and dance to the white man's drumbeat, really. We need to know that. We're not given a pass in not knowing that. It's not excusable for us to not know that. So why should it be any different for non-Indigenous peoples to know how to work with us, especially in something as pivotal, as important as land management and emergency management? It's really time to move on from that conversation and say, no, there is a reasonable expectation that society has that land managers know how to work with Indigenous peoples. There is a reasonable expectation that emergency managers do know how to consult effectively and respectfully with Indigenous peoples to make sure they are not isolated in an emergency response. I think these are very reasonable expectations, and if it means that non-Indigenous peoples need to go back and retrain, go for it.
I love it. That was such a powerful speech you just gave. It's
I could listen to Bhiamie preach all the time. Get him, Bhiamie.
Yeah, like the words you use are so powerful, and I don't think people like myself or non-Indigenous people that are in positions of power over the land, over the in the colonial system, they don't get talked to like that, right? They don't get put in the place of like, hey, here's the context that I have that you're missing, and like you use the word weaponized, and you use the word, I'm forgetting now, but it's so perfectly contextual, right? You're like, hey, listen, I have to do all this stupid shit that you make me do because it's your culture. How come you can't, like, why is it unreasonable for you to understand my culture, right? And it's a fascinating issue.
It's all like privilege.
Totally.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. Right. And I'm learning so much just from this last 40 minutes that we've been talking, from listening to you contextualize it in a way that I've never heard before. You know what I mean? That concept of just, hey, we are forced to do what you want us to do. How come? What the hell? Like, the inequality is just crazy.
And we're not asking people to go back and radically change who they are, and radically. I think that, and this is the thing about privilege, right? When people are asked to give a little, they feel like it's kind of they're being persecuted in it, and it's like it's got nothing to do with you personally. It's just kind of, and if you feel personally attacked or personally uncomfortable, like you really need to sit with that and really think about that, And people who like to, in my experience, people who don't like to engage with the things, like they're really intellectually lazy. They don't like to think, right? It's like, dude, wake up, get your mind out of bed and go for a jog and, clear your head and, like, think. Be happy to think about it. Be happy to be unsettled. That's where growth happens.
It's the ego, right? I find it's the ego that steps in the way and just doesn't allow you to be wrong, as if there's something unacceptable about changing your mind and growing, right? Like I already have it all figured out. You can't tell me anything. It's just, it's exhausting.
Yeah, that's right. And the thing about it is that, certainly in my experience, when people open themselves in that way, when people are willing to let in things that they weren't before, when people want to grow and do better and be better, right? They feel better about it as well. Like, it's exciting. It's, it's fascinating. It's enriching, and it's, motivating. So it's kind of like there are no losers when people want to learn and want to grow and want to, learn about themselves so that they can then engage more respectfully with other people. And I think for what you get in practice, especially in things like land management or fire management, well, you get people who are like a workforce and staff and crews who are just better at their job. So who doesn't want to be better at their job?
Who doesn't want to be a better person, more contextualized, more better perspective, right? I love that concept of that's the zero-sum game, right? Like that's not it's not the way it works.
Yeah. By me too, I just want to bring up, I was just so proud of you and my other Aboriginal colleagues around the time of the Royal Commission for the 2020 bushfire. And in Canada, we don't have things like that. So I was wondering if you could explain, what a Royal Commission is and your submission to the Royal Commission on the 2020 bushfires. I thought that it was, really beautiful how you testified, and then also in the piece that you wrote there.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. So the Royal Commission for us is like a really, it's a really big national inquiry. So for us, a Royal Commission, it's almost like an act of parliament that gets passed for a national inquiry to look at a certain event or process. So previous Royal Commissions or recent Royal Commissions that we've had like a Royal Commission into banking and insurance in Australia. We've had a Royal Commission into the treatment of children and young people in the abuse of children and young people in religious kind of institutions. We've had a Royal Commission into the treatment of people with a disability. So like really big kind of ideas, really big concepts and really big processes. So after the extraordinary event of the bushfires, we had a Royal Commission into those bushfires, really. It was the full term was the Royal Commission into National Natural Disaster preparedness arrangements or something like that. I don't know, something really
some long title.
And it's like, you should have just called it the Bushfire Commission, but that's what we called it anyway. What we, but even sort of like the work with the Royal Commission started before the Royal Commission was called, because what we did was, when the event was unfolding, we wrote a working paper, and in that working paper, we looked at, two previous really big, not national, but really big inquiries, after that occurred after two really big fire events in Australia. So we looked at the bushfire inquiry for the 2003 Canberra bushfires and also the Victorian Royal Commission that was called in 2009 after the Black Saturday bushfires. So two really catastrophic, highly damaging bushfire events that happened. We looked at those because we needed to analyse those to look at how and expose how Indigenous peoples had been made invisible in those inquiries previously. And what we found was that in those two previous inquiries, Aboriginal people, Indigenous peoples were just nowhere to be seen. The Canberra bushfires had one acknowledgement of Aboriginal peoples as possessing the land before colonisation, and that was it. The 2009 Black Saturday Royal Commission spoke about Indigenous peoples only insofar as their cultural heritage values in the land, so their people and their presence as people was not in there. What we found was that there were more references in that inquiry, in that Royal Commission, to Indigenous ecosystems than there were to Indigenous people. And so by kind of looking at those, we got an evidentiary basis to then say these processes have, they are colonial processes and they have erased Indigenous peoples in the past. And we started to advocate openly that Indigenous peoples needed to be not just like but a central part in this new Royal Commission that we knew was going to be called. And we had,
good for you.
yeah, so even the fact that we were there, Amy, was not by accident. Like, we had to fight to be there in the first place. And so so we weren't completely satisfied with it, because the terms of the Royal Commission, like the government sets the terms, which means that it is bound by what the government is and is not willing to receive, I guess. But we had a small opening, because for the first time we did have in the Royal Commission terms to like inquire as to like Aboriginal people's cultural burning experiences was the specific line item in the terms of reference. And so that just opened a door for us to get into the room. And I think about it as like I was one of the people, the expert witnesses that was called. So yes, we made an inquiry. Me and some colleagues, Dr. Jessica Weir and Francis Markham, who we wrote the paper with, made a submission, and then myself and a few other colleagues were called as expert witnesses.
So what does that mean? Like, you have to, like I was saying to Matt, I think they swore on a Bible, but I don't really know what. But it's like a legal process, right? It
is a very, very legal, very bureaucratic process. So you have to, they reach out to you to kind of, vet you, I guess, in the first instance, and then they send you a letter of summons, which means that you're legally obliged to rock up and to tell the truth. Yeah, and so and then we got so the summons, and then accompanying with the summons was like an official letter of invitation to come and to participate in it, and then you get briefed on questions and responses, and like what you're meant to do and how you're meant to behave, and then you get called. The day comes and you go, and then you can choose to swear on a Bible or choose to take an oath. And then I just took an oath. And basically it's like a law, it's like a courtroom then. You can't sort of, step outside of the very tight rules of the officialdom. And you can't tell lies for fear of sort of, being held in contempt and that kind of thing. So, but we were called as expert witnesses, so we weren't kind of too worried, because we were invited to talk and they wanted to listen. And so, like I said, a door kind of got open to us that wasn't there before, but talking with the colleagues before, it was very obvious that we seen this opportunity not as a nice kind of, not like, a nice, dare I say, civilized way of just kind of coming in and sitting and talking quietly and educating. It's like, no, we wanted to like slam the door open and come charging in and sort of get our information, just slam it down on the table, and then just sort of, put things out there in a way that was just so irrefutable, that was clear, that was concise, and that was just the most powerful things that we could deliver at that time. And so that's what I guess we tried to do, and I think we achieved that in some respects anyway. Even though we were, the item in the terms of reference was only to do with cultural burning, our interests were much wider than that, and we made that known. Even though they couldn't report on it, it is on the record, and that was really important for us. Things like the population of Aboriginal people that were affected, the number of Aboriginal children and young people and babies and infants that were affected by the fires, the fact that we know that children's development is there's a delayed consequence for children's development after these catastrophic events. So it doesn't happen in the 1 or 2 years after. It happens in the 3 to 5 years after that we start to see the impact of these events on children's development. So that was really important to get out there. And also that, we aren't satisfied with the expertise in the emergency management sector, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done there. And that, for us, one of the limiting factors isn't, yes, it is kind of money and access to programs and training and that kind of thing. But some of the biggest things that affect our ability to manage the land is access to land. We still are dispossessed of a lot of our country, and we can't manage it if we don't have access to it. And just the racism within a lot of emergency management agencies across the country. And so these are all things that we tried to get across in one way or another. A lot of them got reported. Like the stuff around cultural burning definitely got picked up, and I feel like the Royal Commission did a good job of simply clarifying and creating a national reference point for what is and is not cultural burning. For instance, cultural burning isn't something that non-Indigenous land managers can do. Like, it's not something that you can go out with a local kind of native person and, they can sort of talk to you about cultural burning and what to do and what not to do. And then, you get back in your trucks, they pat you on the back and say, off you go. You guys can cultural burn now. Like, it doesn't work like that.
Or just come for the picture. That's the one I always love, to get the picture.
But like things like, if you want to support cultural burning, it means supporting local Indigenous peoples. It means supporting them on the ground. It means supporting them and engaging them to design their own programs to deliver cultural burning in their own ways. The cultural burning is different across the country. What works in one community isn't necessarily going to work in another community, which makes complete sense because the land is different, the environment is different, the geography, the climatology is all different, and so the fire regimes would be different. So these are all things that we said that were really picked up, and so what we have now is a really strong reference point to fight against the co-optation of our knowledges with regards to cultural burning. So we've managed to stave off the dogs with that one, and we've managed to kind of keep cultural burning within our own arms, which was really important because in the early days, after the Royal Commission anyway, the discourse was very much around what non-Indigenous people can learn from Indigenous peoples. It's like, no, let's not go there. No, we've had it.
I'm so scared of that, Bhiamie. Like, here, it's just, we've had so much press interest in cultural burning, and all that I've heard is, what can we learn from this? And they wrap it right into prescribed burning. And it freaks me out.
Yeah, no, it is. It is scary. And like, it's not to say that fight's over. We still have to do it. But we like in Australia, through that process, we were provided a platform to, I guess, write our own terms for that, and we did. And that's very clear and on the record now. And so that's something that we can continuously rely on. So there was that. And the other stuff that we spoke about, like the unique impacts on Indigenous peoples, the disproportionate impacts, the number of children that are affected, the racism in emergency management, agencies and services. So that stuff wasn't reported on because it wasn't in their terms of reference to report on. But we made sure that we were provided the opportunity to say it on the record in those spaces anyway. And the media definitely picked that up. So even though we couldn't, like, we were very hamstrung with what we could get into the final official report, but we made sure we were creating opportunities to get other messages, really important messages, out in other ways. So the media picked it all up, and a lot of scholars use our testimony to reference like things like the unique impacts and the disproportionate impacts on Indigenous peoples as well, because it's kind of like it's another form of just getting it on the official record, and we did that. So we used it strategically.
Yeah, the Indigenous children thing has not really gotten any attention. Like Dr. Bryony Towers, has done so much work on, bushfire and children, but I know even she was saying that there's just has been a lack of research or even interest in impacts on Indigenous children.
Yeah, so in Australia, and I know it's very much similar in Canada, the population distribution of Indigenous versus non-Indigenous populations are very, very different. So for like the like on a y-axis, it's like the population distribution for non-Indigenous people is kind of like a bell curve, with it coming out sort of like the most people around kind of middle age, and then it kind of tapers off in either direction. Whereas for Indigenous peoples, it's at the bottom. So we're a population growing from the bottom up. And so it's kind of, like not a perfect kind of diagonal line, but it is does resemble that somewhat. So you've got the largest portion of Aboriginal people in children and young people with very little elders, and kind of like the axis kind of goes along that trend. But what does that mean in terms of when these disasters hit? It means that the services that are provided to support communities in the medium and long term are very, very different. So you've got larger populations of Indigenous children and young people. So how are you supporting their education and development? Like I said, in not just the 1 or 2 years after, but the 3, 5, 7 years after, to make sure that they are provided the same opportunities to achieve academically, to make sure that you do have the family services and support services to appropriate services to support families through and post those kind of events. When you're looking at things like where there's been destruction of housing, how are you rebuilding houses that are supporting that know and are supporting family units in those areas? So all of these questions are really, really important. And, like, what's more important than supporting kids to come out of these kind of disasters and make sure that they're given every opportunity in life as well. So that remains something that we keep watching in those bushfire communities. And I think it was also a larger lesson with COVID, right? And children and young people that are living through these extraordinary times. So, the world has fundamentally changed, and how are we changing it as a society and as parents, to support our kids and make sure that they're not being left behind in all of this. It's just one of the most important things that we could think about.
I wanted to ask a question on the Royal Commission again. I just wanted to know how it felt to go in there, like a cultural tsunami. Like, did it feel like you had the weight of like all the Aboriginal people in Australia on your shoulders, and that you were finally able to speak your truth? Or how did it feel to be in that position?
It's conflicted. In one respect, you felt really, I guess, really powerful because you had a voice, and it's we had a powerful in that, yes, we had a voice, and we had a captive audience that wanted to listen. So I think that was genuinely, what it feels like to have a voice. But I feel conflicted about that because that's how white people feel all the time.
Oh my God, isn't that true?
We got one day in this really big Royal Commission, really big process. We had one day to make our voices heard. We had one hearing. The Royal Commission went for over 100 days. And so many different testimony, so many different agencies and staff and survivors, and people. And not to say that there weren't other Indigenous peoples who were, especially as kind of survivors and people who were kind of directly impacted. Yes, there were people there. But there is no doubt that whilst we had a very small opportunity to make our voices heard, it was still limited. It was still marginalised. It was still contained. And as I said, I know people. I work with people who testified to the Royal Commission more than 3 times because they occupy a certain position in emergency management. and people who have testified to royal commissions in the past. So people who, this was like another part of their job. Like there's one colleague I know that has testified to 6 different commissions or inquiries, like those official processes over their career, 6 different times. And so whilst it felt really powerful and satisfying to step into those spaces and do it, under no illusion that the fact that it was unusual speaks volumes, and the fact that we were only given a very small amount of time to talk about what are very complex, historical and very difficult topics, also kind of, I don't know, I just, we've still got a long way to go.
I feel you, but I mean, we have a similar process here that I was involved in, where they were doing basically a commission on emergency management. And so they invited myself to come talk about Indigenous emergency management in Indigenous communities, but nobody who was on the panel who was writing it up was Indigenous out of all of, the 20 plus academics that they had. So it's very frustrating. And I mean, I called them out on it in my presentation and just said, we shouldn't just be special guests at sessions. We should be on these panels and commissions that are looking into these things. Yeah,
right. When are we going to have an Indigenous person who's a Royal Commissioner?
Yeah, exactly. They always like to it's like the whole thing about, the side special panel at conferences and stuff.
Yeah, right.
Instead of having Indigenous people, present throughout, just having a special session where they push us.
Yeah. And like, what would it look like if we had an Indigenous Commissioner? What would it look like if we had an Indigenous person who was like drafting the letters patent, drafting the terms of reference for these inquiries? Like, how would it look? How would it feel that is different to how it looks and feels otherwise, So it's,
Yeah, the last BC, we don't have royal commissions, but like the last BC fire review or something, Maureen Chapman was actually probably there. I think their first Indigenous woman who was involved as, it was her and one other person that were the commissionaires or the people in charge. And I thought because of that, it was a very different report. Yeah. But I also know that there was a lot of internal conflict, because you had these 2 totally different views present on how, the report should be written, who should be interviewed, who should have a voice.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. So it's, so these are sites where, colonial conflict is still endemic. So we just need to keep advocating and keep, banging at the door anyway. So, and it's just not good enough to ignore us anymore. So now we need to fight in a different field, and that is about how we actually get people involved in the decision making about these processes.
For sure. So, Bhiamie, just to wrap up here too, I wanted to bring it a bit to your PhD research. I know you're focusing now on, Indigenous men and masculinity and these ideas. I just wanted to have a quick chat with you about your thoughts of masculinity and fire management. Yeah. I know it's probably something you could talk about for hours, but I really see it interesting here, just especially in the last fire season, having this kind of gung-ho masculine fire culture, I think has been really interesting. And I don't think Indigenous people fit well into it. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, not at all. So my topic is on Indigenous men and masculinity. So the PhD is called Indigenizing Masculinities. So it's kind of, looking at sort of what does masculinities discourse look like from an Indigenous perspective, and how is it different to how non-Indigenous people talk about masculinities in the 21st century. So, the PhD topic actually came out of my time working with ranger groups, working with fire management groups, because when we're out on the land working with people and researching with communities, I found something just really so interesting, and that is that in these land management groups, in these cultural land management groups, they're full of young guys, full of young Indigenous men. And you get out on the land and you work with them, and you sit with them, and you talk with them, and what you hear and what you see and what you feel are just these gentle souls, these really strong cultural beings, these young men that are just wanting to learn, that love being with one another, that are like just so strong in who they are. then those experiences just run so counter to how we think about Indigenous men, or how Indigenous men are portrayed in dominant society. And, or the portrayal of Indigenous men is often as, the predator, as the abuser, as the alcoholic, as dangerous, as as a beast, really. And you go out with these other young guys, and you could not think of a more inappropriate ways to describe them. They're just nothing like that. And so I was really, really interested in, what is it about this work that brings young Aboriginal men into it to mentor them, to learn them, to educate them, to keep them connected. What is it about the work that really draws them in, and what does it give them, and what are they giving back? I just think that, and as I've kind of moved through my life and professional and educational journeys, I've also seen this come up in other areas. Like, I've got a background now in Indigenous governance as well, and in those governance and political and decision-making spaces, you see both the best and worst of, I think, men in particular. You see some men that are really kind of, want to stomp their hand on the table and say, I am the boss, or I am the chief, or I am, this is the men's way. Decision-making is men's thing. And, I just think that's such crap. And I've got, we know where that kind of comes from, right? But conversely as well, you get some male leaders that are just, as I said, it's kind of gentle and very strong people, but just kind of really gentle folk who are really strong and who just go about their way fundamentally differently. So I just kind of see that there's really interesting stuff to think about, and I think sadly people aren't thinking about it enough, especially men aren't thinking about it enough. And when you think about the deplorable rates of violence against women and children in our communities, so first of all, it's understanding more about that violence, and what place or what role Indigenous men play in that process as well. We don't know enough about that. But in particular, Indigenous men, Indigenous men and land management in particular around cultural burning and stuff is really, I think is a really important part of it, and is going to be a really big part of it as well. So, I've got more questions than answers at the moment.
So in your panel discussion, you were discussing agencies trying to fit the cultural burning into fire management, right? We discussed a little bit of that, taking the knowledge and that thing. Then they're not discussing how to decolonize the system and how to do it differently. So what is that? What is decolonization to you? What does that look like? And because I think for someone like myself who's not in that world, it's not clear what that word means. So if you can describe your idea of it and how we can accomplish it, because it sounds like up until this point you could really describe these types of concepts in very clear, obvious ways that almost make people shake their head and go well, yeah, if it's that simple, why aren't we doing it? I just wanted to know your thoughts on it.
And Matt was saying too, at first when you heard it, Matt, hey, you were saying that you got kind of scared, what does decolonization mean? We all have to leave?
Yeah. Get back on your boat and back to England, you schmuck. Yeah. So it's what is that concept? Because I don't think it's something that's talked about widely in the non-Indigenous community. It's just not a word that you hear, right? So
decolonization in the context of this kind of work, the first step that should be taken is employ Indigenous people, get them into the organization. Bring, it's just ridiculous for people to talk about decolonization without actually providing opportunities for Indigenous peoples where there weren't opportunities before. And we're not just talking about providing opportunities for Indigenous people as trainees and as park rangers and that kind of thing, but as, senior managers, as as department heads, you need Indigenous peoples in the organisation and a part of the structures of the organisation from the top down, to really embed those voices and perspectives and experiences throughout every level of the organisation. That's you can call that decolonisation. I just call that common sense. That you should just be empowering Indigenous peoples and employing them and especially anything to do with the land. So what you have is a structural and sustainable voice then in the organisation. It's great. It's fantastic. Indigenous peoples have a lot to offer and will offer a lot and enrich the business of an organisation. So, get on it, get them in and support them and create spaces for them. But conversely as well, and this is where the other part of it is that what work needs to be done within an organisation and organisational culture to make safe the environment to bring Indigenous peoples in. You can't just bring the Indigenous peoples into a white institution and say, here you are, we've given you a job, our job, we're done, and just go back to doing things the way that you did them before. Because one, that's not safe, and two, you're just perpetuating a problem and creating a new problem as well. It's bring Indigenous peoples in, but then make safe the environment for Indigenous peoples to thrive, to prosper, and to bring their voices in and bring their experiences in and value add to the business of the organisation. I think that's where the larger lesson on decolonisation is: how are non-Indigenous people being transformed by working with Indigenous peoples, by learning from Indigenous peoples, and fundamentally looking at the land and their place in the land differently. That looks very different for individuals, and it will be very different according to where you are and what organisation you're in and what time and year and political environment you find yourself in. It looks very different, but I think the personal journey on that is the journey is common, the outcome is different. So, just like I was saying before, you just need to kind of get around it, be willing to have, things that you know questioned. You will be required to question things that you previously didn't question. Rather than reacting badly to that, you should welcome those as really transformative and learning opportunities.
I love that concept. I've talked about that lots in my other show, and about just questioning your assumptions and your preconceived notions and asking those fundamental questions of like, why do we do this way? Why have we not discussed it more? I love that. That's great.
Yeah, and I think with the bush, like your bushfire season, ours in Canada, here in California, what it's really showing is that, we're not managing things properly, right? When you're having these mass devastation events. And I think that's where the interest in Indigenous people and cultural burning comes from, is that people are getting, worried when you see these things happening. So we're not doing it right. What's another solution that we can go with? And it needs to not be people need to not feel like it's an attack, like Bhiamie said. Yeah. It's an opportunity to do things better.
Yeah, that's right. So I think climate change is both a threat to Indigenous peoples, but a gift to Indigenous communities for re-empowerment. Like it's just such a strategic opportunity because people are really asking questions that they never asked before. They want to do things differently. People want to be led down that track. And, we don't have all of the answers, but we've got some pretty useful suggestions. And it starts with empowering Indigenous peoples, giving them agency, giving them a voice in places where they've historically been marginalised for. And yes, giving as much of the land back as possible to Indigenous peoples.
How can we burn if we don't have any land?
Right.
What the heck?
Right. And it's so if you're talk about decolonisation in this space, if you're not willing to talk about how to get the land back to Indigenous peoples, well, then we're not going to get anywhere. And we're just going to be tinkering at the edges. There is a fundamental component of land and land repossession of Indigenous peoples that is just such a core part of it. And rather than that being seen as like, they're coming for my property and all this kind of thing, the fact is there's so much land in these places, and, Indigenous peoples were dispossessed of so much of it. So, yeah, let's have a healthy conversation around what land repossession looks like and land justice looks like for Indigenous people.
In Canada, too, I don't know what the situation is by me in Australia, but in Canada, I think it's like 80% of our land is crown land, so owned by the government, where it's actually not even in private hands. So my first thing whenever I say land back is like, let's start with that land first. We can get to the private owned land later.
Yeah, there's parts of the land that even non-Indigenous people, just don't want, apparently. So, give that land back. We'll take anything back,
Yeah.
Just give us as much of it back as possible. And then we'll start to talk about, what kind of resources we need to manage that land effectively to mitigate the risks, which everyone will share. Everyone will share that risk. So, yeah, let's there's a lot of really healthy, fertile stuff to talk about, and we just need to, be brave enough to have it in a lot of different ways. So there's both practical steps, short-term steps that people can take in this space that shouldn't be offensive to anyone. So that's kind of like, let's get the low-hanging fruit, and then let's have a conversation around how we can ripen the fruit further up the tree, so that we can pick that when the time's right.
Yeah, I find that with cultural burning, it's a rant I've been going on lately is about the romanticism side. So the agencies and other folks, they like the nice ideas around cultural burning, but when it comes to the things that actually require organizational change or to address systemic racism, that's immediately when support weans a little bit.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, and it's like here in Australia, people like to talk about cultural burning, but what they don't like to talk about is how their own land management regimes and fire management regimes that prescribe burning stuff actually contribute to the problem rather than mitigate it. And when Indigenous people come into a room and tell them that, they really don't like it. And so, there are warm and fuzzy things around cultural burning that we can get, and we should have that, and we should feel warm and fuzzy about that. But there are also really, conversations with jagged edges that we need to be happy to dive into, and we shouldn't be taking those as attacks, but learning from that and having conversations around that stuff as well.
Awesome. Bhiamie, you're the best. It's been a long conversation. So we'll we'll wrap up there. Matt and I were just saying we could ask you a million questions to discuss these things.
Absolutely. No, that was incredible, Bhiamie. That was very powerful, and I definitely learned a whole bunch. So I appreciate you taking the time to go through your thoughts and speak your story, because I think we'll see where we go with this season, what we end up doing. But I think it would be might be a real possibility that we should maybe try and do this again for a second episode in this season, because I just think you've broken everything down in a way that it's so digestible and so understandable to someone like myself who's not in that world. And I think it's a difficult thing to do. So I think it'd be good to maybe try and get you on again sometime here.
Cool. Sure. Absolutely. Sign me up anytime, guys. I'll support it.
And we'll be thinking of you too through the COVID-19 situation. I know in your community, you've been doing amazing work. Everyone should follow Bhiamie on Twitter.
Yeah, definitely do that.
Yeah, no, this is a scary time, but really would welcome the opportunity to come back on and have another yarn with you both. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks a lot for listening. I hope you liked that. Come back next week for a conversation about social license. It was interesting. We'll see you next week. Take it easy.